So who is the world's most successful perfumer today? Well, some people might argue that it's Quentin Bisch, and there'd be lots of reasons why you would think it would be Quentin Bisch. Really, he's a very young perfumer, he's got loads of fragrances under his belt, and they have been enormously successful for the brands that he's worked for. He's in demand. But why has he got so many top 10 fragrances? What is it about his creations that makes them special? What means they have captured the moment right now and have reached the dizzying heights that they have done? Quentin Bisch has a very distinctive signature style, and I'm going to look at that style in this video. I'm also going to tell you about the history of Quentin Bisch and really talk about where he came from, how he got into perfumery. It's not a traditional route, it's really quite an interesting tale. And also I'm going to talk about some of his most famous creations. So if that interests you, then please keep watching. If you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology even, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and please also press the like button if you do end up liking this content. So Quentin Bisch stands out for a few reasons, but really he stands out because he didn't qualify for Perfumery School originally. He came at perfumery through a very unconventional route. And it was really his passion that got him eventually into Perfumery School rather than any kind of qualification. And that's just a really odd thing. That's unusual in the world of perfumery. And that really gives him a different angle on fragrance. So let's look back at his early years. So Quentin was born in Strasbourg in France in 1983, and his dad, when he was 5, went to work in London. And actually Quentin spent a few years in London. He went to school there until he was 7, and then the family moved back to France. Quentin says that he has very clear memories of summers in London. He has clear memories of the parks in London and of the smells that he experienced while in London. He also says that his childhood was surrounded by fragrances, and that was because both his parents wore fragrance. So, for example, he says that he was birthed in Shalimar. His mum was wearing Shalimar when she actually gave birth to him. Later on, she started wearing things like Cacharel's Lulu, Dior's Poison, Chanel's Coco, and also Kenzo Jungle. His dad wore Guerlain's Habit Rouge, Vetiver, and also Derby. Later, he wore Chanel's Pour Monsieur and also Gucci's Pour Homme. Quentin says that during school, he was always fascinated by the fragrances that his teachers wore. And there was one particular teacher that he just needed to know what fragrance she was wearing. He was obsessed with the smell of this teacher. And one day he asked her, and he felt terribly embarrassed and like he'd really overstepped the mark. She didn't tell him, and he ended up sniffing through shelves of fragrances to try and identify what this particular teacher was wearing. And actually, she was wearing YSL's Opium. Bisch says that this teacher changed her fragrance very often, and Bisch credits her with introducing him to the power of fragrance. Quentin says that really from the age of 11, from those moments in school when he was smelling those fragrances on those teachers, that was the point at which he knew he wanted to be a perfumer and nothing else. In interviews, Bisch has talked about school as a moment of feeling restricted by rules over creativity. So he says that he really enjoyed music, he really enjoyed writing, and he just felt like he was being stifled in his creativity by having to adhere to how he was taught to do things. An example of this is when he was learning the piano. He really gave up on lessons at quite an early stage. So as soon as he could have a decent level of musical ability, he just decided that he wanted to explore music independently and be more creative without being stifled by rules. Bisch says of school that he was far more artistic and creative than he was mathematical or scientific. And that was a problem because he wanted to get into Perfumery School. So Perfumery School actually requires you to have a chemistry degree. Teachers told his parents that perfumery was a lovely dream, but that he was far more artistic than he was scientific. Quentin persisted though. He really wanted to go to Perfumery School, and he knew the only way to do that was to get a science degree. So he actually enrolled in a science degree, and for 1 year he persisted in trying to knuckle down and trying to engage with it, but he just couldn't do it. He gave up. Instead, Bisch actually transferred onto a theatrical studies degree, and by the age of 24 in 2007 he had gained 2 master's degrees. Despite this, Bisch just couldn't forget his perfumery dream, and he began writing to eminent perfumers. Eventually, Quentin got to speak with the director of Givaudan's Perfumery School, and he told him that whilst they do take on apprentices, they weren't doing at the time, and that Bisch should increase his knowledge of perfumery by going away and working as a perfumer's assistant. So eventually, Bisch got a job as a perfumer's assistant working with Michel Amouage. And Michel had actually created fragrances for Bond No. 9 at the time, so for example, the Scent of Peace, but he was probably best known for the Gucci Rush range. So under Michel's tutelage, he worked for Robertet in Grasse, the home of perfumery in France. Bisch says Michel taught him lots about ingredients. Michel actually made Bisch take a fragrance that was already on the market and try to recreate it from scratch in the lab. This was to teach Bisch both how to interpret fragrances, how to identify ingredients, and how to use ingredients. After a while, Bisch felt like he'd done what Givaudan's director of Perfumery School had asked him to, and so he applied again. He had a series of interviews along with 10 others, and eventually he triumphed. He got the place at Perfumery School. So ironically, Bisch's first fragrance is uncredited, and that's because he was still a student at the time. So the first fragrance that Bisch helped create was Reminiscence Essence, which was released in 2010. This perfume is based around star anise and it's meant to recreate the idea of a starry night. Bisch wasn't technically allowed to work on perfumery briefs as a perfumer's assistant at the time, but he had created an ideal accord of benzoin and amber for this fragrance that one of the perfumers at the company was very taken with, and so she encouraged him to try out for a formula. He made something alongside her and she submitted it as an idea for this perfume under her name. When this particular formula was chosen for the fragrance, she revealed Bisch's input, and Bisch was invited to the launch. If you check databases, Bisch is not credited, and actually his first fragrances appear around 2013. So 2010, Reminiscence Essence was his first fragrance. Bisch studied at Givaudan and worked at Givaudan with some really impactful perfumers, including people like Louise Turner. And eventually he qualified as a perfumer. In 2013, Bisch started working for État Libre d'Orange, where he created the fragrance Fin du Monde. Here he was trying to give an idea of an explosion. In this case, it was an explosion of popcorn and seeds. In 2014, Quentin Bisch met Olivier Cresp and they wanted to discuss a new project. They were looking to modernise Angel and they wanted to create a flanker of Angel. So they started formulating, and eventually, after an entire 2 years, they brought Angel Muse to the market. Angel Muse really struck an excellent balance between the newness with the hazelnut, but also a nod to the old Angel. It pleased both fans of the original fragrance and it brought new fans to the brand as well with its modernity. Mugler absolutely loved Bisch's creation and they decided to make it an even bigger launch. They made an entire brand new bottle for Angel Muse. They didn't use the star-shaped traditional Angel bottle. And they also had a huge ad campaign at the time with Georgia May Jagger trying to aim this fragrance at a younger clientele. And it worked. It was a huge success. Bisch describes Angel Muse as having more ethyl maltol, so the cotton candy note, the sweetness, than Angel, more vanilla than Angel, but being balanced by vetiver. He compares the composition to the addictive quality of salted chocolate. He describes the fragrance as almost smoky, woody and nutty. So during that time, Bisch was also working with Ex Nihilo, and in 2015, Fleur Narcotique was released. Ex Nihilo's guidance on what they wanted from a fragrance was Parisian chic, modern Parisian chic. Bisch used a trademarked Givaudan ingredient, Petalia, which is a rosy note with peony and grapefruit facets, which dries down into a more powdery rose. Is this sounding familiar? Bisch describes Petalia as very long-lasting, very diffusive, a little bomb. Fleur Narcotique is really an overdose of Petalia, and this kind of peony has been reimagined in other fragrances. So, for example, Ex Nihilo's Fleur Narcotique is often compared with the later Ormond Jane's Levant. In 2016, Bisch went to work for Missoni, and he worked on their original EDP fragrance. Again, he used Givaudan trademarked ingredients, including Petalia again, and also this time Mahonial. So Mahonial is another one of Bisch's favourite things. So it's a magnolia or a lily of the valley style floral smell. Bisch says he formulated Missoni EDP in only 3 weeks, which really might explain just why he's so prolific, why he's really churning out these fragrances, why he's really not a very old perfumer at all. He's 42, yet he has all of these releases in his back catalogue. So in 2017 came the big one. Bisch decided to go and work for Parfums de Marly. So in Parfums de Marly, we all know Bisch's most famous creation is Delina and its flankers. Delina was followed by Delina Exclusif in 2018 and finally La Rosée in 2021. Bisch describes the Delina family of fragrances by contrasting them. So he describes Delina, the original, as roses blooming in full sun at midday in a garden. And he compares Exclusif as the same thing but at night. And he describes La Rosée as the prequel, so it's the roses at dawn with the dewiness still on the roses, saying that the range reflects the same idea but with different atmospheres. Bisch also says, interestingly, that when he first approached Julien Sprecher, who was the olfactive director of Parfums de Marly at the time, with the idea for Delina, Julien didn't like it. And actually, Bisch had to persuade him because Julien didn't agree that it was a good direction to go in. So moving on to 2018, Bisch returned to the designer world and we actually got Chloe Nomad. So Chloe Nomad was really a huge hit. It really got a lot of attention, and that's because it's a modern chypre. And this really took chypres in a different direction to old style vintage chypres. You know, chypres were something that was very out of fashion at the time of this fragrance being released. So Nomad is a modern chypre with a citrusy sparkle and with a mossy woody bite to it. It's very long lasting, really quite strong, and really shows all of Bisch's signature elements to it, which I'll discuss later in the video. In 2019, Bisch went to work for Jean-Paul Gaultier and he produced another hit. This time it was La Belle. So La Belle for Bisch started with vanilla. So Bisch says that La Belle was inspired by Le Grand Cru Vanille, a French cake, and that La Belle is vanilla in all its states, so powdery, dark and leathery. Bisch says that La Belle was really the first fragrance where he tried to create an accord around vanilla, and since La Belle, Bisch says that he's a vanilla lover. In 2020, Bisch went back to work for Mugler and he created this, Angel Nova. So this is a fizzy pop effect of lychee, raspberry and rose, very distinctive with that akagala wood in the base. Really creates the idea of a fluorescent, larger than life, bright pink, raspberry and rose. In 2020, we also got Bois Imperial from Essential Parfums, and that fragrance again was based around Petalia, but also this time with akagala wood, the ingredient du jour at Givaudan. In 2021, we got Maison Crivelli's Hibiscus Mahajad. This fragrance really does remind people of Delina Exclusif, and there are certainly similarities here. Again, it's based around rose and vanilla. Also released in 2021 was Montclair Perfumes. So this fragrance is a powdery vanilla, but it's famous really for having a snow accord. I think again this is something that is trademarked by Givaudan. And yeah, it's basically a powdery warm vanilla. And yes, again, it was a huge hit. In 2022, Quentin Bisch moved on to working on the Dries Van Noten fragrances. And Dries Van Noten released a series of fragrances that year, and one of those fragrances was Fleur de Mal. So Fleur de Mal has a juicy peach up top and then a leathery osmanthus. So you will learn later in this video that Quentin Bisch really likes the note of osmanthus. And then it also has a suede ambery base. So when talking about Fleur de Mal, Quentin Bisch says that he wanted to create a fragrance of contrasts. So Bisch thinks of osmanthus something that's quite innocent, but also something that can be quite sensual and even animalistic. He says this flower that can look like an angel can become evil. Right, so next we're up to 2023, and you all know what's coming. This is his most famous fragrance, really, nowadays. It's probably even overtaken Delina in its success, given its price point. But this is Amouage's Guidance. It truly was the fragrance of the year of 2023. It had a really interesting use of pear and hazelnut. Also that year, Quentin Bisch also worked on another fragrance line for Perfumes de Marly, and he released Valea. So Valea, or Valaya, I never know how to pronounce it, also has that pear top note, but along with his old favourites, Petalia, Mahonial and Akagala wood, along with a new ingredient from Givaudan, Nymphial. So Givaudan described Nymphial as something that smells along the lines of cyclamen, but also with muguet, so with lily of the valley as well. And also say that it has green, watery and even linden blossom, so sort of lime tree blossom, fragrance facets to it. They describe Nymphial as something that can make fragrances smell like a watery white floral or sometimes a creamy white floral, depending on how it's used. 2024 was again a big year for Bisch. So that year saw the release of Guidance 46, the extrait version of Guidance from Amouage. But it also saw him moving in a slightly different direction to what we might expect, actually. So he released Teriac and also Teriac Intense for Lattafa. This actually wasn't the first time that Bisch had worked for Lattafa, even though I think most people wouldn't recognise his first efforts for Lattafa. So back in 2014, Bisch created another fragrance for Lattafa called Route al Banat. This was a peachy, milky tuberose fragrance, which was actually uncredited for Bisch in the Fragrantica database. In 2024, Bisch also worked for Balmain and created 3 fragrances for that brand. And actually, 2 of these fragrances are widely compared to other fragrances that Bisch has created. And this is something that you will see again and again. So we're bang up to date now in 2025, and so far, it's only May, remember, we have already seen the release of Fétiche La Rose from Christian Louboutin, and we've also seen the release of Amouage Existence, which is formulated by Bisch as well, along with 18 other fragrances that Bisch has created, and it's only May. So moving on to what is typical of a Bisch fragrance, how can we recognise a Bisch fragrance? So clearly there are some people who absolutely love Bisch fragrances and others that really don't. And I can totally see both sides to this. And I think it's going to depend on your view of certain aroma chemicals that Bisch uses. He does tend to use similar ingredients across a lot of his fragrances. Clearly they change over time, but he does tend to revisit note structures in his fragrances. Because of this revisiting, he does tend to accidentally, or perhaps even on purpose, dupe his own fragrances. And that's not a criticism. A lot of perfumers end up doing that. For example, Dominique Ropion. Quite often you will see repeated note profiles in his outputs. But sometimes the brands that perfumers are working for may actually request that. If another brand has had a successful fragrance, maybe they want a piece of the pie. And maybe that particular brand will put that information in the brief as an instruction to the perfumer. So I think my advice with Bisch would be that if you love a particular fragrance from him, maybe just wait a little bit, because he might produce an accidental dupe for another brand, and that might be at a more affordable price. So for example, if you love Perfumes de Marly's Delina, you might have smelt something similar in Carolina Herrera's Very Good Girl or in Mugler's Angel Nova, because he formulated all of those fragrances. Similarly, if you love Ex Nihilo's Fleur Narcotique, you might really enjoy Perfumes de Marly's Valea. If you love Amouage's Guidance and Guidance 46 Extrait, you might really love Balmain's Carbon. If you love Chloe's Nomad, you might recognise similarities with Chloe's Citrus. If you love Marc-Antoine's Barrois Ganymede, you might actually really enjoy Essential Parfums Bois Imperial. So next, what is the hallmark of a Bisch creation? What kind of note structure screams Quentin Bisch? Well, clearly we know that Bisch ditched those piano lessons early on to allow his creativity to bloom over rules. And I think it's the same thing with his fragrances. He's really got his own style. So when I think of Bisch, I quite often think of relatively sharp top notes or something that gives a bit of a punch in the beginning. But then I also think of florals in the mid. So often it's creamy or icy florals. And then for base notes, I think often of molecular notes. So things like akagala wood, things like ambrifix, versions of ambroxan. I think of his fragrances as being very punchy. They're things that are long lasting and that have a presence to them. Bisch admits that he has a particular style, and he describes his creations as being light and transparent, but also being powerful and long lasting. Bisch actually said that he wants to create the idea of a fragrance consistently pulsating after application. So which particular notes does Bisch tend to gravitate towards? So for top notes, you're thinking things like fruits. So often it's quite sparkly feeling fruits. So things like rhubarb, lychee, raspberry, pear, even peach. This gives an immediate brightness to his fragrance. This is what brings the lightness and transparency that he aims for. Bisch describes the heart of fragrances as being all about emotion, which is why he tends to use flowers. So as we've seen, he really enjoys using rose and peony, and we've seen that he really loves the molecule of Pétalia from Givaudan. So he uses this in things like Delina and Fleur Narcotique, as we've seen. But he also likes strong, translucent and creamy white florals. So things like jasmine and also magnolia. So for example, he really loves the use of mahonial, which is used in things like Missoni EDP and also Kenzo's Ciel Magnolia. He also really loves osmanthus. So for example, in Amouage's Guidance, where he really plays on the suede facet of osmanthus, but also in Dries Van Noten's Fleur du Mal and also in Penhaligon's Vavarum. So for base notes, we're always thinking beast mode and long projection for Bisch. So things that Givaudan have trademarked, so things like ambrifix and also akagala wood are things that he really loves to use, but also suedes and musks. So which fragrance would I say would be the best example of Bisch's traditional style? Well, I think if you sniff Delina, if you sniff Valaya, and if you sniff Guidance, you're pretty much there. When asked about his style, Bisch said he thinks it's funny that people from his own company can recognise his fragrances because he says that he doesn't repeatedly use the same ingredients and he doesn't feel like he can define his style. But he says that it's not necessarily the ingredients or particularly the style, but more how he plays with the ingredients in the fragrances that he produces that makes them so distinctive to the people he works with. So Bisch is well known for creating fragrances for both the niche and designer markets, and he was once asked what's the difference between creating something for the niche market versus the designer market. His answer was not that much. He says he works with bold accords for both markets, but the difference is, for designer, you have to please more people. So he says this is why designer fragrances are often faceted and have things to appeal to certain groups, whereas he contrasts that with a niche market and says you can just base a fragrance around amber and spices, and that's something that isn't going to appeal to a wide range of people. And he says that's the difference. Just the range, the audience that you're trying to aim the fragrance at. So Bisch is 42. We know he made his first fragrance, even if he was uncredited for that fragrance, back in 2010. So he's only been active for 15 years. Yet if I look on base notes and check for his output, I can see that he's created 207 fragrances. That's an output on average of 14 fragrances a year. And we know in those early years, he probably wasn't producing very many fragrances because he wasn't getting many calls to make fragrances probably. So how is he managing to produce that many fragrances? Well, Bisch is said to actually work on between 5 and 10 fragrances at a time. And he's also known to have a travelling organ, a travelling perfumer's organ that's been created by Givaudan for him so that he can create on the go. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do press the like button and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know, what are your thoughts on Quentin Bisch? Have I talked about your favourite Quentin Bisch fragrance? Are you someone who loves his fragrances or someone who loathes them? I think Quentin is quite a divisive perfumer. He's someone who has a very distinctive style, as we've discussed, and that really does create a split in people who love his creations and people who don't. So I'd love to hear both sides of this tale, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. you.